It's Monster Mondays with me, Jeff Arbuckle. Well, hello, it's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. I'm Jeff Arbuckle, and of course, this is Monster Mondays, presented to you by Film Seizure. You can catch new episodes of Film Seizure with myself and Jason Oliver on Wednesdays, but you know what I'm going to say here. Mondays, they are for me to talk about monster movies. Now, Boris Karloff makes a return visit to Monster Mondays in his most recognizable role that made him a horror icon for all time. Of course, I'm talking about the movie Frankenstein. What most people get wrong, though, is that Karloff doesn't play the title character. Oh no, that's Colin Clive. He plays Dr. Henry Frankenstein. Now, Karloff, of course, is simply billed as the monster. You know, that's the thing a lot of people always do, isn't it? It's one of the most common misnomers of all time. Frankenstein is not the creation or monster, if you wish to be insensitive. Frankenstein is the scientist, goddammit. Boris Karloff, and later names like Christopher Lee, Bela Lugosi, Lon Chaney Jr., Robert De Niro, and David Prowse, is the monster, period, end of story. Naturally, I may actually call the monster Frankenstein from time to time just because I don't want to be that guy in some social circles, but whatever. This story, while the second in the Universal Classic Monster cycle after Dracula, is by far the most popular and the one that probably has the lasting legacy greater than any other film monster. This movie came out about 3 weeks after Halloween in 1931. It was made for just over $262,000 and ended up grossing a whopping $12 million. That kind of money by 2019 standards is roughly $37 trillion. To call this movie a phenomenon would actually sell it short. Of all the Universal monsters, Frankenstein had the biggest franchise. Most everyone knows who the Frankenstein monster is, and he's appeared in several other media and various other representations as well. Between September 15th and November 1st of each and every year, you would be very hard-pressed not to see that big lugs green mug when you're at a store watching TV or seeing the neighbor's Halloween decorations. Almost everyone over the age of 10 has seen the monster in some aspect and can at least point to him and call him by his incorrect moniker, Frankenstein. Like Dracula, Frankenstein didn't start off as an original movie story. In fact, not only was it a novel already 100 years old at the time of the Universal film, but it was actually written by a woman. Most assume that Mary Shelley was a one-novel wonder with Frankenstein, but she actually was a professional writer. Her husband, Percy, was much more remembered throughout history, but Mary herself was a professional writer. She wrote novels, essays, short stories, and worked as an editor. In her time in the early 19th century, she was taken pretty seriously as a liberal voice. Even as a woman, she was kind of thought to be an equal among men when she expressed her opinion. Interestingly, as time went on, her role and stature as a writer of political commentary was later lessened, and I guess the common word for it is Victorianized, as they would call it. Her husband became more of a central figure when talking about her and point almost entirely to Frankenstein as her primary success, despite her having many successes throughout her career. Oddly enough, the shift in how people perceived her was mostly due to her own son and daughter-in-law censoring a lot of biographical detail and information about what made her seem much more conventional than she really actually was. But for Frankenstein, that's why we're all here. The 1931 film really only covers about half of Shelley's novel. The other half will be covered in a different movie and a separate Monster Mondays episode. This part is all about Henry Frankenstein achieving a goal of giving new life to a once dead person. Through obtaining bodies from the gallows or from freshly buried graves, Henry is able to piece together a creation that basically makes him a god. However, through a little bit of ignorance and hubris, Henry doesn't realize the brain he placed into the hulking monster is a criminal's brain and therefore abnormal and potentially dangerous. As the monster is revived and begins to understand his own existence, things start to get a little hairy. He doesn't have control over his own strength. He doesn't understand a game he plays with a small girl that ultimately leads to him accidentally murdering her. He's lonely due to his appearance, frightening the villagers. His confusion and frustration leads to anger, and soon he seeks answers and runs afoul of the town's celebrations over Henry's wedding to his love, Elizabeth. Once it is revealed that he killed a small girl, the town picks up its torches and, as angry mobs of town people will do, chase after him and seemingly kill him by trapping him in a windmill and burning it down. Dr. Frankenstein himself very nearly isn't able to escape the scene with his own life. But let's get to the three things that I like about the 1931 Frankenstein. First, everything about Dr. Frankenstein, particularly in the first half or 2/3 of the movie, is brilliant. Frankenstein was played by Colin Clive, as I mentioned earlier. He had a handful of roles in the 30s. Sadly, he died from tuberculosis, and that was only compounded from being an alcoholic. At the beginning of the movie, he's almost a villain. He's manic. He's obsessed. He's almost singularly focused on proving his theories about bringing dead tissue back to life. When his mentor, Dr. Waldman, played by Edward Van Sloan, who makes his third appearance in a Monster Mondays movie, comes with Henry's fiancée Elizabeth and his friend Victor, Henry gloats about how Waldman's teachings about death were wrong. Of course, he proves his theory right, and he has this famous exclamation of, "It's alive, it's alive." Once he is removed from his castle where he performed his experiment, he eventually returns to sanity, but is overcome with the burden of responsibility and guilt over his creature's actions. My second item is another thing that is often referenced incorrectly. Dr. Frankenstein's hunchback assistant, played by Dwight Frye, who was also Renfield in the original Dracula, is often thought to be named Igor, the hunchback usually seen assisting the doctor in other versions of the Frankenstein story, particularly in cartoons, as well as Mel Brooks' amazingly funny Young Frankenstein. But it actually isn't. He is named Fritz in this, and Fritz is not the loyal servant we typically see in several representations. Yes, Fritz does take orders from Frankenstein, but he's also kind of implied to be some sort of sadist or criminal. He's a henchman to the doctor more than anything. Almost instantaneously, Fritz decides to physically mistreat the monster. He whips him and teases him with fire, which the creature is, of course, afraid of. Fire was always the creature's number one weakness. After finally having enough of this asshole shenanigans, the creature strangles Fritz and kills the jerk ass. It's kind of a cool scene, but the Fritz character is kind of a fascinating character because he's the one thing that actually fits the least in all of these characters in this movie. He's not a doctor. He's not a scientist. He's just kind of a bad dude. The monster is not a bad dude. It's just kind of the accidental creation of Frankenstein, and he actually kind of wants to be a good dude, but Fritz, he does not want to be a good dude. Lastly, I don't think it's possible to talk about Frankenstein without talking about the laboratory set. It is the blueprint for every mad scientist set from that point on to forever. It's got switches and knobs and blinking lights and dials. It's such a fantastic set that when Mel Brooks made the aforementioned Young Frankenstein, he didn't just recreate the original set. He used the actual original pieces to rebuild it just as it was. It is a piece of art in terms of set design that will likely never be repeated in any movie ever. As an extra bonus thing, I wanted to mention something about the monster himself. As a fan of little details that help with logic or explanation, I absolutely love the creature's neck bolts. Considering the use of electricity to reanimate him, it can only make sense that he would have these bolts, kind of like a car battery, to be able to feed the juice into him. That's just brilliant in my mind. But that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. Until next week, see you later, and don't forget to check out new episodes of Film Seizure each and every Wednesday and a new installment of Monster Mondays on Monday at the website filmseizure.com. And also, don't forget to check out new posts at my website, bmovieenema.com, each and every Friday.